Sorry about that. The U.S.-Mexico relationship, the Texas-Mexico relationship. And now we want to widen the aperture post-lunch and really look at what's actually happening in these places. Because one of the things that I think skews analysis for those of us on the U.S. side is that we tend to look at things from, I think rationally, a Texas-centric or U.S.-centric perspective. And that's good. At the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we're in that business, and we properly ought to. But at the same time, there's tremendous value, analytic and otherwise, in seeing things on their own terms. So what we really want to do with this panel is understand what's happening in Mexico on their own terms. Really get a dive down in reference to itself, rather than in reference to, say, Texas or the United States. So, with that in mind, I have with me, very privileged, four individuals whom I'm privileged actually to call friends in addition to colleagues, people who in my professional life have been tremendously powerful through their work and time and generosity and explanation in helping me to understand what's going on in Mexico with our southern neighbor. So I'd like to introduce you all in no particular order with the tan jacket right there, my good friend David Ogren, who is a senior fellow with the Secure and Sovereign Frontier campaign at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. David is a journalist, professional journalist, who's covered Mexico since 2005. I will tell you as kind of an editorial note, within the journalistic community, the foreign journalistic community in Mexico, there is nobody, and I mean nobody, who is better at explaining the country and understanding it with empathy, but also with clarity, than David. So I encourage you to seek out his work. He focuses on politics, security, immigration, and the Catholic Church. His work has appeared everywhere good: USA Today, The Guardian, Washington Post, Financial Times, The Lancet, and the Catholic News Service. David is a Canadian national from Calgary. From Calgary, yes, and but currently resides in Mexico City. Next to David, we have Todd Bensman. Todd is an investigative author of the 2023 book Overrun: How Joe Biden Unleashed the Greatest Border Crisis in U.S. History, and also America's Covert Border War: The Untold Story of the Nation's Battle to Prevent Jihadist Infiltration. He's a two-time National Press Club Award winner and a former journalist of 23 years. He currently serves as the Texas-based Senior National Security Fellow for the Center for Immigration Studies. Todd frequently reports from the southern border, traveling widely inside Mexico and Central America. Again, I have to add a coda to this. It's not enough to say that Todd travels widely inside Mexico and Central America. He goes places that the rest of us dare not go, and get stories that the rest of us are frankly, too solicitous of our own lives to get. And so I admire him for his intrepidity and his bravery in venturing into places that even I won't go in Mexico. He's testified before Congress as an expert witness, regularly appears on radio and television outlets, discussing illegal immigration and border security. And for nearly a decade prior to joining CIS in 2018, Todd led counterterrorism intelligence for Texas DPS's Intelligence and Counterterrorism Division and its Multi-Agency Fusion Center. Over on the end, my good friend Jessica de Alba Ulloa. Since August 2023, she has been a researcher and adjunct professor at the School of Political Science and International Relations at the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. She also serves as a lecturer at the School of Global Studies, Universidad Anáhuac, where she had a dynamic tenure of 19 years, progressing from a professor to the director of the Center of Research on International Relations. Professor de Alba Ulloa has gained prominent fellowships like the O'Gorman at ILAS Columbia University, the Fulbright from the U.S. State Department's Program on National Security and Policymaking, and the Salzburg Global Fellowship. Her scholarly pursuits revolve around international relations theory, international security, U.S.-Mexico foreign policy, bioethics, and diplomacy. And she holds the distinction of editing the first book on international relations theories in Spanish. I did not know that. The very first one. Okay, outstanding. And another significant work on Mexican foreign policy, alongside several others, authors, book chapters, and specialized articles. She holds a BA in international relations from the University of the Americas, Mexico City College, a master's in diplomacy and negotiations, and a PhD in political science, both from, I'm so sorry, I don't know French phonemes, Université de Paris Sud in France. I wasn't expecting to have to do France today. So sorry, but an eminent friend. And finally, several of you already know our good friend Alicia Galvan Lopez. a fellow for U.S.-Mexico relations at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and also the founder and president of Fundación Patria Unida por un México Valiente. Her career has consisted of advising legislators in the legal and legislative field, both in the Chamber of Deputies and in the Senate of the Republic of Mexico. She received a law degree and a master's in government and public policy at Universidad Panamérica and is currently studying for a master's degree in family science. And Alice, may I introduce the most important member of your family? Is that quite all right? Alice's 2-month-old son, Umberto, is also with us, doubtless trying to figure out whether he wants to have a policy career or not. So thank you all. Thank you all. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Thank you. In explaining, we can hardly cover this topic in the time available, and so like with the other panels, my colleague Grayson here is going to wave a sign when it's time for Q&A. We want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to ask the questions that must be asked. When I was thinking about explaining what's happening in Mexico, and in candor, I still don't know, having worked in and around Mexican-related affairs now for several years, I feel like I'm barely scratching the surface. It's such a vastly complicated topic, but I wanted to focus on a few items that might be of interest. And Alice, I want to start with you, if we could. One of the things that observationally has been very distressing, as somebody who values liberty in the abstract and also in general, is seeing the Mexican regime's war on civil society. Mexico had, post-2000, post kind of the pre-autocracy, had a vibrant civil society, a fantastic elections integrity operation at the federal level, and that has gone away in the past several years. Can you tell us about that? What's happened to civil society in Mexico under the current presidency?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Joshua, for inviting us, TPPF, and especially I want to thank TPPF to opening the door to those who were in May in Miami with the Heritage Foundation and the Secure Free Society, a group of brave people who is defending freedom and democracy. No, and that's what we have to do, to work together. So thank you for doing this kind of summit. It's really important to work on that. I also want to express my solidarity to the United States, to the conflict and challenges that you are braving, and the common challenges that we are fighting together. No. What's happening in Mexico? And with that, I'm going to answer your question, Joshua. Okay. Well, I think that we are facing a common problem. We are facing a left-hand socialist government. And if we understand that, we can solve our problems. What does a left-hand socialist government means? Well, we are facing an authoritarian government that controls all the institutions, the public institution, but also that actually is controlling the private institution. And that is a big problem for the civil society, right? What other thing? They are control all the media in Mexico. We don't have conservative media, for example. And the only one who is speaking the truth lives here in the United States. Because in Mexico, if you are against the government, you take a risk. No? And that's what's happening here. So the government, and especially not all the government, one person, the president, who is the one who controls everything, controls the narrative, controls his party, and controls the country. Nobody can do something different if he doesn't approve that. That's the reality. What else? We are facing a government that changed, and it's the most, for me, the most dangerous thing that is happening in Mexico, that changed in his international alliance. Now we have a government that closed the doors to the Western Hemisphere, to the United States, and we have a government that opened the door to 3 enemies of the United States: China, Russia, and Iran. Now our government is working with China, Russia, and Iran. In Mexico, nobody knows. We're like, nothing is happening here. But 2 months ago, in the Independence Day, after the Independence Day, we have a military Paris, and there were invited the Russian military and the Chinese military. That send you a danger message, and we have to focus on that. And that is also a risk for us as civil society. Why? Because they don't want organized civil society. They want to control the society. So they are also against us. They are also against freedom. They are also against our human rights. And that's the big problem in Mexico. Another big problem, we really don't have a strong opposition in Mexico. So we don't have a party that really represent the conservative ideas. We don't have parties that really defend our democracy. Why? Because of corruption. So this president controls also the opposition. If you say something against this president, they came to your door and say, hey, you have this. Silence, or you will have problem with me. No? And also that happened with the businessmen. And also that is happening with some foundations in Mexico. So now, being against this president, being against the left hand in Mexico, means that you are going to take a big risk, but it also, I think it's our responsibility. No? So now we are working on that. We have a lot of problems, yes. I know that maybe here it seems like to be terrible working with Mexico. Maybe you will qualify Mexico as an enemy. But I'm going to tell you something. In time of crisis, there are also leaders that take the risk to convert this crisis in opportunities. And that's what we are doing by the force and the strong by the social civility.
Thank you so much for that, Alice. Jessica, I saw you nodding when Alice said that Mexico has a weak party structure. Can you tell us how we understand Mexican political parties now, or if we do?
Yeah. Well, the thing is that since we don't have strong institutions to start with. We have a very feeble and weak democracy that has been built along the years, because before we had 70-party rule, there was a very authoritarian party which selected who was going to govern Mexico in every sexennial, every 6 years. So when we changed to a different party, which was center-right, sort of speaking, the PAN.
In 2000.
In 2000.
Yes,
well, that was a very... there was not much for him to do because he didn't have the chambers in Congress. And that made the work very difficult. Nevertheless, we had a second one from the PAN, Felipe Calderón, who started the war on drugs. And he started to build a very professional police force, which was destroyed when Peña Nieto from the PRI, the PRI, so the previous party of 70-year rule that we had gotten rid of, went back to power with a very young and very handsome candidate that saw a refreshing image of the PRI, which was just, a makeup. So he destroyed the police work that the Calderón had started, and it was a massive stealing of public resources. But they did, the macroeconomics was good, the microeconomics was good, and they did that to save the boat for themselves, not for the country. And they handed the presidency to this left-leaning candidate that had been waiting for his turn, as somebody said, like for 12 years in looking for the presidency. And while they did this, and he won with a greatest rate of approval, and the votes, the majority of votes went for him. I know many of my colleagues voted for him. I didn't. But what they did was that all of the political class, if that exists, changed parties to be in the party that is in power right now. And so the opposition got, with very few seats, very slim possibility of, fortunately for us, they can stop things at the Senate, but for a very slim margin. And they are completely out to lunch as how to get organized, because they are from sort of right, left, and the pre, which is undefinable. So it is a monster, as you were saying yesterday, a Frankenstein of parties that are trying to get an alliance to stop Morena, which is the movement from López Obrador. And López Obrador is, I wouldn't say he's a leftist, he's just a toxic authoritarian leader that has never worked in his life, and that makes us believe that with 200 pesos in his pocket has been able to achieve what he has achieved until now, which is, of course, not true. But we have to see it, well, I don't, but people have to listen, people listen to him every morning for 2 to 3 hours.
These are the Mañanera press conferences.
The Mañanera press
every day
conferences.
that he does,
Every morning, he feeds the public with lies, saying that everything is wonderful in Mexico, that all the achievements that he had done, that the conservatives are thieves and the rich are thieves, and that they have been taking advantage for the country for too long, and the neoliberal elites that, you know, that he is not going to let them do that anymore. So this is all untrue. Those are all lies, and he builds this narrative very divisive and very simple, but very effective. So opposition is totally lost, and he has the apparatus to make the next candidate from Morena win. I mean, they had their own process, which was a very dirty process, because the candidate who won in this process, Claudia Sheinbaum, who is just a puppet of López Obrador, sort of won because they made this nomenclature of some votes of some people from the party are way more than some others, and that's how she got the nomination.
Yeah. What a system. I want to ask David. I'll pitch this to you. You know, when we talk about systems like this, it's possible to envision particular political systems where sort of like the court politics and the machinations of the courtiers are essentially invisible or irrelevant to daily life. And I think for a lot of modern Mexican history, a lot of that was largely true. It seems less true to me, but David, I want to ask you this. You know, with your decade, 15 years, more than 15 years, 17 years of experience directly in Mexico, observing how Mexicans cope with the dysfunction that results from a system like this. How does the individual person navigate kind of this dysfunction? How do they encounter it? How does it change their lives? And if I could provide a specific lens to look through, it's one that you and I have corresponded about quite a bit. The Acapulco hurricane, right? That's Cat 5 that hits Guerrero, lays waste to it, and sort of lays bare a lot of pre-existing dysfunction that now comes to the surface.
Where to start? I went back and read some reporting that I'd done on Acapulco back in 2013. Was it 2013? Oh, sorry. From 2013, 2014, there was, I think, twin storms. Was it Manuel? And there was another one. It was just exactly 10 years ago. It was completely flooded out. And a lot of the areas that were flooded were, I guess what you call social housing in Infonavit, which was basically the government had this program where you would get it's a payroll tax that funds a loan that you get, and these people got a small house. It was built on a floodplain, typical corruption, government, state-sponsored, somebody gaming the system to get these government-subsidized loans, and people got flooded out. And I just remember somebody sort of saying how, in these cases of disasters, people just Mexicans believe that the dice are loaded against them up in the heavens, and it's there's a sort of a feeling sometimes that it just sort of feels like Lopez Obrador has been there sort of to sympathize with people, but not really do anything to mitigate the pain, mitigate the suffering. You look at that in the pandemic. He was, he at his press conference, he pulled out a couple of what they call detentes in Mexico, which are just basically images of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and he pulled them out, and these are my bodyguards, and it was an
I'm
appeal.
sorry, he did say the Mañanera?
Oh, absolutely.
Good heavens! I'm sorry. I apologize for interrupting. I'm shocked
And
by that.
and so and I know everybody sort of, a lot of you see it reported in the media as he pulled it, he believes in amulets and so on, but what I think what a lot of people fail to recognize is that people the Sacred Heart of Mexico is just a very deeply rooted belief in a form of popular piety in the country. And here's the president up there just basically saying, hey, I'm expressing the same beliefs that you are. But in the meantime, he's not spending any money to mitigate their suffering while they stay at home and don't work. Basically doing nothing to fund this health system. He's sending all this money still to the military to fund his a train circling the Yucatan Peninsula, building an airport that's literally used north of Mexico City. He didn't invest in vaccines. Basically, vaccines came in part because, at one point they deployed the National Guard to the southern border to stop migrants, and suddenly a couple million doses of Pfizer vaccine showed up. So it's just sort of I don't know how to, if I'm describing it well, but it just sort of feels like with Lopez Obrador, he definitely he knows how to talk to a certain constituency of people. And I wouldn't even say it's the very poor, it's the people that are sort of the moderate poor that sort of live in the working class areas in the surrounding Mexico City as an example. And you see that in one of his main programs is he got rid of a conditional cash transfer program that went to the very poor. And it was basically women that took their kids to see the doctor and put their kids in school, they got money. And it worked very well, but he didn't like that. That was neoliberal. According to him.
He didn't like it because he didn't control the disbursements. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And also he believed that the National Action Party, the program started, I believe, in the Zedillo years, in the late 90s. He believed that the National Action Party was using that to win poor voters, and that was supposed to be his constituency. And so what he's just done is he just gives everybody, I don't know, 5,000 pesos every 2 months, I guess $250 to $300, and it's just universal. So I remember sitting with a person who paid for the coffee with me with an American Express Platinum, and he told me that he got the $250 every month. So I mean, but for Lopez Obrador, he believes that he's gotten rid of all the corruption. That's how he sells it. But it's all these people are getting a little bit of extra money, and so this is where. I think that's a part of what people like about him is just that they see him on his side. He'll say things like, we got rid of this program that was corrupt, even if it wasn't, and we're just giving the money to you. Oh, look at these public trusts that fund science, that fund movie making, that cinema, fund disaster relief. They got he liquidated that public trust. But then he started saying, well, we're giving this to fund scholarships for poor kids in the poorest municipalities of Guerrero. It's this very neat narrative of I'm taking from these privileged people that were privileged before, and some of them were, and I'm giving it to the poor. So it comes with this narrative, and I'll just leave with this. It's very hard to describe the identity politics that Lopez Obrador plays, but he plays it masterfully. And Morena, the name of his movement, dark-skinned woman. And that's also for the national patroness, so it's double. So it doesn't
the Virgin
get
of Guadalupe.
Virgin of Guadalupe doesn't get any more nationalistic than that, but also sort of appeal to the people that are, class and race in Mexico are kind of tied together. And so it's sort of like I'm on your side. Yeah. And so, and against these other people that were elites and discriminating against you, and he does that very well. And there's a narrative, there's iconography at times, and he's up every morning talking for 3 hours to reinforce that, and to also troll the opposition, and the opposition being as inept as they are, they just keep falling into it every single time. They just don't know. He doesn't know when to stop trolling, and they don't know when to stop responding. So.
Thank you, David. Todd, I want to ask you about a specific aspect of this issue. When we talk about the individual Mexican navigating kind of the state of Mexico now, we're not just talking about corrupt formal institutions. We're talking about, frankly, malevolent informal institutions, chief among them the criminal cartels that we know pervade various areas of Mexican life, but geographically and in terms of class and governance stratum and things like that. You've been into places in Mexico, northern Mexico in particular, that ordinary reporters won't go, ordinary scholars won't go. What have you seen in Mexico, and what have you perceived in the way that people have to live in order to support families, stay alive in candor in places that are either controlled by or significantly affected by the criminal cartels?
Okay, that's a big question. I guess I would start by just pointing out that things are not as complicated sometimes as they're portrayed in terms of Mexico's domestic policy decisions. What I mean by that is that the Mexicans will typically, if they're left alone by external forces or factors like, for example, the White House, the Trump White House or the Biden White House, or even Governor Abbott, who's lately been able to toggle pressure on Mexican governors by closing the bridges, the international bridges. But if left alone, they default to their national interest, which is to move the people coming through their southern border with Guatemala to the U.S. border as quickly and smoothly as possible. That is their national interest, because no country wants to be stuck with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants, and they're illegal coming through Mexico often. So if we just kind of remember that, then we can better understand that the typical journey of illegal immigrants, and when I go down there, I surround myself with them and interview them. I've probably interviewed thousands of them. Their journey changes by U.S. pressure on Mexico. For example, you mentioned the National Guard deployment on the border with Guatemala. That was a Trump-era thing initially. We're going to do progressive trade tariffs up to 28% if you don't do this. Stop them at your southern border. Biden comes in and says, we'll take away the trade tariff threat. And so Mexico responds by a tactic called ant operations, which is to say that, for example, the recent caravan, there's been a lot of coverage of this big, huge 7,000 caravan. Well, you won't see that anymore once it gets past to about central Mexico or Tapachula, and then the Mexican government will split them all up and send them to 10 different states so that we can't see it. They like it invisible, and they like it moving fast. All of those people in that caravan are going to end up crossing the border. They're probably crossing right now as we speak, and that ant operation, split them up into small, unseeable lines, goes on all day, every day, and has for months and months. When they get to the border, there are two things that happen. A lot of people, there is a narrative in the U.S. that nobody crosses the southern border without paying the peso to the cartels. So that is largely true, but that is not 100% true. So the way it typically works is there are family units that will just self-cross. They find out where the spots are. They're not paying anyone. I talk to them all the time. Who'd you pay? Nobody.
Is there geographic specificity to that, or are
Yes.
there some areas where that happens more?
Yes. I mean, there are areas of the border where no family unit's getting over without paying 10 grand or 9 grand or 15 grand. They're paying in a lot of places. But For example, in Juarez, where I spent a lot of time, on the east side of Juarez, you'll have the runners, the ones that have to pay. They know that they can't turn themselves in because they've probably got criminal history. Those ones will have to pay 10 grand to have somebody put them through a hole in the fence and then run into New Mexico or be guided through the desert by cartels who then have their operatives on our side pick them up. We all know that story. But on the, I said the east, I meant that was the west side. On the east side, you'll have those family units just crossing on their own and turning themselves in. On the American side, they use our wall for shade while they're waiting to be brought in by the Biden administration. When you talk to those people, they'll tell you, I never paid anybody. Nobody ever asked me. So the cartels kind of leave them alone. Del Rio sector, Piedras Negras is another area where the cartel there is actually the state government. It's the state police. And they can't really afford to be seen in daylight beating people up and killing people and enforcing the rule there. So it's a kind of a safe place to cross, and it's cheap to cross there. So it just depends on, each area of the border is its own ecosystem, I have found. There are areas where, I mean, I spent a lot of time recently, most recently in the Fronton, Roma area, on our side mostly, and they would come in, and I would ask, what was over there, and it was the cartel. There are two cartels over there, and they were paying each one. How much did you pay? 9,000. How about you? How about you? How about you? All the way up and down the line until I had 20 of them who didn't know each other saying, I spent $9,000 for me and my kid. I had to pay $15,000. They just picked the wrong spot. They should have gone somewhere else. However, the cartels offer full service menus, so they actually began their journey and paid for their journey back in their home countries.
Right.
So that's a full service that they're paying for. They are going into debt. All of them told me, I said, how much did you give them up front? And the answer was nothing. We're broke. We're Hondurans. What's going to happen? And then I start getting into the nitty gritty of how are you actually going to pay this off? Like, who gives the money to who, where? And the answers were fascinating. Most of them were saying, our family, when we start working, we'll send the money, wire the money back to the village, and our uncle, cousin, parent, whatever, will then pay the guy that'll come by every week with our money. So a couple of them said, I'm going to LA, they'll have a guy there visit us and we'll have to pay him there. And then I always ask, of course, the obvious question is, what happens if you don't pay? And, I mean, for one thing, they're probably not going to get killed because a live worker is better than a dead worker, but they might do something to them. Beat them up or do something to their family. Or if they get two in arrears, they may figure, why not just kill them and send a message.
Yeah, or family left behind. Thank you for that. One phrase, Alice, I guess I'll toss this to you first, but Jessica, I want your opinion on it as well. One phrase that I see a lot in I guess kind of Mexican public spaces, and I've seen this on the Tlatelolco massacre memorial in the Zocalo in the middle of Mexico City, and I've seen it in graffiti, and I've seen it in signs at protests. Is the phrase "fue el Estado"? It was the state. So there's a crime like the Ayotzinapa massacre in 2014. It was the state, and so there's this refrain over and over that whenever something horrific happens, it was the state. And in candor, it seems to be frequently true that it was the state. Fue el Estado, es verdad, right? And so this happens. And so here's my question: when you have this public assignation of responsibility, fue el Estado, married to, Jessica, what you called weak institutions, chronically weak institutions. In any other context, that would be not to trespass on the bounds of political science, but I mean, think of any other context that would be the recipe for an insurgency or a revolutionary situation or something like that. That doesn't really happen in Mexico. However you want to characterize the cartels, which I think is a little bit qualitatively different. What explains that? How can you have this combination of weak institutions, popular distrust of the state, and the mass of the citizenry does not act as they would in other kind of comparative IR scenarios? Alice, I'll toss that to you first, and then Jessica, I want your take.
Well, I think that is because of our history. We always are waiting for a messias to save us, no? So we don't have to do something. Someone is gonna come and say, hey, I'm the messias, I'm gonna save you, and I'm gonna do everything. López Obrador is the messias for the poor people. López Obrador was the messias for the people who hate the parties PRI, PAN, and PRD. They say they are corrupt people. No, we need something different. So here comes a new messias. It doesn't matter if it's left hand, right hand, conservative, not conservative. He only needs to be the new messias. And we were like, okay, I have a work, I have my house, I can study, I don't have to do something else, no? So the problem is that we have and maybe if Mexicans hear me, they are gonna kill me, but the truth is that we are a very pathetic society. We have a very pathetic society, no? And we are waiting the state to help us and to save us. At the same time, we don't have responsibilities, no? So if something is wrong, the state have the state did it, no? And we don't have responsibility. But at the same time, we need a state to save us. And that's what Andrés Manuel López Obrador understood. So right now, 30 million people receive money, as David told us. And how can we work, how can we do with these 30 million people that don't have money by working, no? Or that doesn't have to eat? They only have what the government gave them. So for Mexican people, it's easier to say the government, the federal government have the responsibility to do everything. We have a paternalist state. And I think that's the problem.
So even if the father of the paternal estate is bad, he's still your father.
Yeah.
And he's still responsible.
And the media class was safe, no? So if I have a work and I am safe, it doesn't matter who is governing us. Until now, that this government really affect the poor people, but also the media class, or also the businessmen. So right now, civil society is opening her eyes and said, okay, it really matters who is in the presidency, because that really could affect us. But that's until now.
Thank you. Jessica?
Yeah, I would agree with what Alice said, only with a caveat. The history of how the PRI, the PRI, the authoritarian party and centralist party that governed for 70 years after the revolution. Well, it changed names twice, but after the Mexican Revolution in 1910. So we Mexicans, as you were saying yesterday, Joshua, we are Mexican. We're not Spanish. We're not indigenous. We're Mexican. We're a mix of many things. So independence, we started to govern ourselves. And if we go back to the Constitution and then the Constitution of 1917 after the revolution, it wanted to be like the Constitution of the US, like the model of the checks and balances. The only difference is that you start your Constitution with "we the people." And in Mexico, it's void. It's nothing. Nobody has the power. It's not we the people.
So I have to admit my ignorance. I've never looked at the Mexican Constitution. There's no preamble asserting the source of
Say we the
sovereignty,
people?
or no?
No?
Okay, incredible.
So to start with that, then this narrative, it's a two-edged narrative that the PRI built at that time after the Mexican Revolution, which didn't change anything, by the way, from the independence, and it just, the power changed hands. That was all. It was the narrative of we are weak, and we are hijos de la chingada, excuse my French, because
We won't close caption that. Thank you.
because we are the Mexican people come from the son of an indigenous woman, Malinche, and the conqueror, Hernán Cortés.
And Cortés is a hate figure, right? I mean, he's in traditional Mexican nationalism, he's a figure of disgust, and
He's a villain.
he's a villain.
He's a
yes.
villain.
Yes.
So we are doomed from the beginning. We are victims. And that is what López Obrador plays. This victimhood that the grain in the idiosyncrasy of Mexicans at the time, and that has continued. That was one edge, and the other edge is this hate and love relationship with the US. And the hate comes because, oh my God, the United States invaded us and they rob us from half of our territory. Come on, that's how things were done back at the time. And it was a huge amount of territory that nobody governed. They didn't have the capacity to govern the whole territory that was Mexico. So get over it and take responsibility over what you can do and manage your own country. There is nobody coming to save us. If we don't do our work, nobody's going to do it for us, not even the United States. Though, that said, the Biden administration just turns their eye to what's happening in Mexico. Oh, the president is attacking the National Electoral Authority. Oh, well, the Department of State says, oh, that's not good. But that's all. So democracy is eroding, institutions are being attacked. They don't say anything. We have the panel because energy violations of the USMCA. Mm-hmm. We have the MGO corn issue. We have this other panel also with Canada, and they're not moving forward because the Biden administration wants the immigration issue low-key, as low as it can, so it doesn't blow up for the next electoral process. And then they turn an eye of what is happening in the violence and how cartels are ruling parts of the country. The last ambassador with President Trump said it. There is I don't know, can't remember, 30% of
he said 35 to 40%.
Percent that is controlled by the cartels. The Mexican governmental census authority just acknowledged that for doing the census, they had to pay gangs to go to some places to do the census because nobody dared to go there. And so we see high-level delegations that go over and over to Mexico to meet trade and security. Very secret. Nobody says anything about them. What happens there? And what is happening is just that they try to keep the immigration issue under control so it doesn't really explode and it doesn't turn on votes for the Republicans instead for Democrats. And we have been seeing a little bit of a growing in the fentanyl and methamphetamines seizures in Mexico, but nobody talks about that. It has gone up, but the cooperation is not what it used to be before with Peña Nieto and before with Calderón, because our security systems are just broken, completely broken.
Doctora, I've often believed that you were a Texan born in the wrong place. So
I guess.
David, I want to toss something to you that kind of to sort of drill down on one thing that both Alice and Jessica have just talked about just now, which is an observation from Jorge Castañeda, who was the SRE minister under Fox, I think. No, Calderon. I'm sorry. Oh, Fox. Okay. Well, I had 50-50, and I chose the wrong one. So under Fox, he has this wonderful book, 2011's Mañana Forever. We've talked about it a few times. And so in it, he makes the point that, and he's making a direct comparison to the United States and how political movements are named in the United States. And in the United States, we have, we tend to name political movements after ideas. This is Castañeda's observation: republicanism, federalism, populism, and so on, and we have these names. And in Mexico, they're all named after people: Zapatismo, Carrancistas, Obradorismo, and so on. And so there seems to be this need to go kind of to your point, Alice, to to find the Messiah. There's always this man at the center of it. So looking forward to 2024, obviously there's a presidential election in Mexico happening in, was it June or July? It's in June, first week of June. Thank you. First Sunday in June. And so that election is going to happening. It's very difficult for me to envision, if we assume that the Morena candidate is going to win, which I think is the rational assumption. I personally can't envision Sheinbaumismo. Talk to me a little bit about this. How does this politics of personality survive the AMLO era, or does it?
Well, that's a good question. Is there obradorismo sin obrador? Is there an Obrador? Sin Obrador.
With Obrador behind scenes.
Yeah. Is there Obradorism without López Obrador? I think that's what remains to be seen. I'm a little skeptical. You can look at other parts of Latin America where I spent some time in Argentina. Peronist movement is deeply rooted. You can see how there's a triple-digit inflation and no shortage of social problems, and they turned out their vote, and may even pull this election out. Even the economy minister of a failing economy might actually become the next president, and it's just Chavismo in Venezuela. So, does López Obradorismo continue? I tend to think no, in part because it's too much. It's built on a single person. I can't quite figure out what is the abiding ideology of it. People will talk about, well, it's attention to the social attention to the poor. Read the cash payments. But when I look at López Obrador, what is the legacy? The legacy are a couple of big mega projects that are going to get built over budget. So a new refinery, a new little used airport north of Mexico City. This Mayan train, which is going around Yucatan Peninsula, and then interoceanic corridor across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which may emerge as it's supposed to compete with the Panama Canal. But it's sort of López Obrador pumping a lot of money into southern Mexico, which is where he's from, and they've always got a raw deal. And if you look at NAFTA transformed northern Mexico. Southern Mexico still resembles Central America, and so that's López Obrador's, that's his legacy, that and militarization. The military is now going to be responsible for something like 20% of all federal revenues in Mexico, up from 3%,
and an increasing control of the economy too.
Very much so. And if López Obrador has said why. He said he very much why the military, and why does the military build this new airport north of Mexico City? Why is it finishing up this airport in Tulum and going to operate that starting on December 1st? Why did they just get basically when you visit Mexico from now on, you will pay a tourist tax that goes into a public trust that will be managed by the military. And they will run it. This is an organization which is very resistant to civilian oversight, and is taking an increasingly important role in Mexican public life. Why? López Obrador does not want these projects to be privatized. That's assuming somebody would want to buy them. And he wants these projects to carry on into perpetuity, and the way to do that is to get them in the hands of the military, and the military will not give up. It's like any bureaucracy. It's not going to give up what it's gained. And the word we're not saying, I've been saying is corruption.
Yeah.
So, no transparency, resistance to civilian oversight. They're doing the military is doing all sorts of business. So I think that's the legacy. So does Obradorismo continue? I don't know. Claudia Sheinbaum strikes me as a bit of a blank slate. She's obviously loyal. I think a lot of people on the left in Mexico have sort of been disappointed with López Obrador because he's not. He can be somewhat socially conservative.
Right.
And so, and if you look at sort of things like the evangelical churches, he's done very well courting them. So I just sort of see. I guess what I'm trying to say is, does Sheinbaum sort of just continue on doing with exactly what parroting López Obrador and just continue on with whatever he's doing? I think there's going to be pressure from the Morena, the party, from their lawmakers, their base is to sort of continue on with the project. But I just don't know who has control of it, because it's just it's a really big tent that covers everyone from radical feminists to social conservatives to
everybody else,
plutocrats.
Yeah.
So I just don't know how this Obradorismo continues without him.
Let me give Todd the final word here, and then we have to go to Q&A. So we're a little bit behind. Todd, you were talking about the institutions of the government actually being the ones to speed along a lot of the migrant flows, breaking them up, hurrying them across. You didn't say who in the government. I'm just curious what you've seen. I guess twofold. Which institutions in the formal state are doing it, and what have you seen of Mexican military involvement in this traffic?
INM, Mexican immigration, and the military. It's federal for the most part. They had them bottled up down there for a couple of months, and for 3 weeks prior to the crisis in Del Rio, they were rioting. They were burning tires. They were taking over government buildings. They were beating up cops. They were rushing roadblocks. They were let my people go violence. This was probably okay for a while down there, but the celebration of Independence Week, El Grito, was coming up. And that was going to ruin the party if they kept doing that right through El Grito. So there was a federal decision. It came out of Mexico City to pull up 350 buses and haul them all out. You have 3 days to get on these buses and head to the border. We're letting you free. And they chose Del Rio because, like I mentioned earlier, that happened to be one of those spots where you can cross without paying the peso. So they all went there. And that was a federal decision. They brought up hundreds of buses. How do I know this? Because I interviewed dozens of them, and they told me all about it.
Yeah.
But also,
I remember you. We were on the north side, and you were on the south side, and you had this incredible info about this. So yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, what I see often, for example, I was in Monterrey in May for the final. I'm sorry, not Monterrey. Matamoros. I've been to Monterrey too. But that was the final week of Title 42, and they were pouring over by the thousands into Brownsville. And I was on their side. I was with them when they were doing it, and I noticed that the INM had officers. They're unarmed, but they had officers stationed all along the riverbank. And after about 2 days of watching groups of maybe 300 at a time rush over the river and swim up and climb the riverbank, all of a sudden the INM officers would say, "All right, everybody stop. No more. No mas. Everybody stop." I went up and asked several of them, "What's going on? How come this is, why is this happening?" And the answer was surprising. Our supervisors are in contact with the American Border Patrol intelligence officers who tell us when they're ready for us to let more over so that they can better manage it on the U.S. side. I said, "Well, how does this work?" He says, "Well, we all have WhatsApp, and it's an encrypted app, and the information comes to us, to our bosses, Our bosses tell us when to let them go on the radios. They all have radios.
When the Americans say.
When the Americans say.
Incredible.
And so in this way, it's obviously everywhere I go down there, I'm seeing I&M sort of traffic people through, regulate them often. They'll stand aside. They can block if they want. When I ask them why you aren't blocking, the answer is often, we were ordered to not block them. That's Mexico City.
Just really quick, one quick thing. Central America, you probably know this too. Just as soon as they cross the Darien Gap, they're just put on buses and sent through Panama, through Costa Rica, it's just these governments there just want these people to get through as quick as possible.
It's in the national interest of those countries to move them through. They don't want them lingering. They definitely don't want them rioting in Tapachula.
Yeah.
They'll put up with that for a little while, and then they'll do the ant operations, which are the wheeling up of the hundreds of buses and spreading them across 14 different northern states so that nobody notices. That is organized by the central government.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've got time for probably a couple of questions. There's microphones. Just my only ask is just ask a question. So go ahead, ma'am. Sorry.
Thank you all for your work. For us in Texas, what recommendations do you have for all of us to champion ways to counter the same exact problems that are happening in Mexico in regards to policy, in regards to the victim ideology that's sweeping the nation? I mean, the federal government is gone with that and socialist policies, but I believe in Texas and in other conservative states. But how can states like Texas, stand up and fight against this sweeping corruption that's bleeding into the U.S.?
Okay, I can take a first shot at that. So I spent a lot of time down there with Texas, with our troopers and on both sides. For one thing, you may have noticed that when Texas put out the first 1,000 feet of barrier in the river, the buoys with the nets that hang down to the bottom, they put 1,000 feet. The idea was that they were going to be extending this for miles and miles over time to cut off hot spots for the illegal crossings. The very first complaint came from Mexico City. This is immoral and inhumane. The second that I heard that, I knew that the Mexicans were worried about that barrier because it was effective, and that those people were going to be stuck on their side. And that's the last thing they want. Remember, nobody wants that when they back up. It happened under Trump, and it cost the Mexican treasury billions of dollars to have to contend with all of those people backed up into their country. It was awful for them. That river barrier stuck right now at 1,000 feet is when it clears up through the litigation, you're going to see that thing extended, expanded, and it's going to cause a backup because it's effective. It works. I think there's a lot of people talk about the wall, the Trump wall. That's interior. A lot of that's a couple hundred yards in. They use it for shade under this administration to wait for the Border Patrol to bring them in. That's all that's good for right now because they don't have the other policies to repulse and return. That river barrier is very important. And one last thing is Greg Abbott has been doing something for a year and a half now that is very unsung, which is that he's ordering Texas state troopers to do truck inspections at 100% at international bridges, which has the effect of shutting down commerce with that state. And then they go to the Mexicans, usually the governors on that side, and make demands. You will round them up, you will break them up, you will fix this immediate problem. And they've been doing that from one end of Texas, from Brownsville all the way to El Paso.
Yes.
Just quickly, the truck inspections, that gets Mexican attention, just very, very quickly.
Yeah.
These border towns, all they want is they want that border open for trade. Period. I mean, I was in El Paso with one of the TPBF trips there, and went over to talk to they have the state population council there. Coordinates migrant shelters there, and it's humanitarian, but at its core, it's just to keep migrants from flooding the bridge and closing it to commerce. That's the number one thing Mexico wants. And with the border buoys, the one thing I've noticed in Mexico, ever since then, it seems like Lopez Obrador has changed his tone. He used to never criticize border wall construction, and now suddenly he's suddenly talking better about President Biden, lauding him for being the one president who's never built a foot of border wall, and he's it seems like something's changed in Lopez Obrador's discourse on that. And what I sort of a theory is just that the border buoys, that the Biden administration, I think, saw that as an easy win to get Mexico on their side. We're going to take this case to court. That'll make Mexico happy, and we'll get something in exchange.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. George, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. I'm just going to ask, do you all think that the governor of Nuevo León, Samuel Garcia, has a chance in the presidential race, knowing that the Morena is very powerful, has a stronghold right now?
No chance.
The only thing they want to do is to divide the opposition vote to give more votes for the official candidate.
Yeah, unfortunately, no. We don't have a chance.
Right. I don't know if that's unfortunate. Samuel Garcia, I wouldn't bet on him, but that's what
I would look up a story that was written a website called Rest of World, which focuses on technology in the developing world, and about how Garcia and his influencer wife won in Nuevo León. It's quite a fascinating story.
Yeah, actually, everything could change. Not right now, but the truth is that Morena have all the power. In 5 years, right now they actually govern 24 of the 32 states of the Republican. That means 80 million people. They control 80 million people right now. López Obrador is a movement. So I don't believe that we have the power to take out the next election. But it is really important for us. I think that the presidents, we are going to lose it. But we have to focus on the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. That's very important because it's there where the reforms of the Constitution could work or could not work. So we have to put all our effort in the Chamber Deputies and the Senator. And at the local level, maybe we could have a chance. But at the federal government, I don't believe so.
Just quickly with Garcia, just that he's the way it's been explained to me in there is that he won a very close four-way race, and Morena's very weak in the state, and so because he doesn't have control of Congress, Pan and PRI there can gang up on him. He's sort of he sought protection from López Obrador, so he's sort of a de facto Morenista.
Right, yeah, he did the social media post with Claudia and all that. Any other questions? None. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Addie's got the microphone.
Thank you for being here, guys. I do have a question. You mentioned that as Mexicans, is also my heritage, that we have that victim mentality. And in order to move forward in Mexico, how do we overcome that? I know you have your foundation that is encouraging, but how do you move from this point forward to actually make a difference in a national level and for the extended future, not just trying to fight the parties as they come?
If I may. Yeah, it also has to do with the question of the young woman in the back, and with what Alice was saying about Mexican society is very uphill because we are there is apathy in our society. And also there is, the government has a lot of power. So if you don't like something and you're a businessman, oh well, we just send you the IRS. See if you don't comply with what I'm telling you to comply. So that's what he has gotten away with. Cancellation of contracts, energy contracts, Constellation brand plant, that was at more than 60% advancement, just canceled. The contracts in the new airport of Mexico City, canceled. So if you don't like it, the IRS just goes for you, and they put you in jail. So they're not playing games. So this society is the one who has to change. If we don't change ourselves and we do not do it, and we think that by tweeting or we're Xing now, or by going to protests to the Zócalo, we're going to change things, that's not going to make it. That's not going to cut it.
I think that we have to understand that we are fighting criminals. That's the first point. We are fighting criminals. So we have to fight them. We can't dialogue with them. No, we can negotiate with criminals. That's the first point for me. And society have to understand that these people is gonna break up our freedom. These people wants to destroy our family. These people want to destroy our country. That's the first point. And the second point is that we have to understand that it's not a battle that we can win the next year. They have been working on that for years. So we have to work and battle this for years. And I have an answer that it's not going to be win the next year in the elections. But I think that we have to, well, first of all, we have to solve the problems for the core. And here is that we have to protect the institutions that really make a strong society, that is family. No. So we have to protect our family, and that means that we can make a better society. We have to train leaders with values. We have to train leaders with principles. I believe that the answer is education, education, and education. It's a transcendental battle. Maybe we are not gonna see the results, but that's necessary because we have to educate a new generation. The new generation are the one that can really change what is happening right now, not only in Mexico, in all the Latin American region.
This is such a great question to close on because I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you for asking it. I actually do think that's the core of the issue here. As a friendly outsider, I don't know where you're from. I'm from South Texas, so family roots in Laredo and Corpus Christi, and you actually see there's such huge crossover, obviously, between Mexican culture and South Texas culture for obvious reasons. And sort of in a lot of ways the same, I would never dare say this in English, but the same hijos de chingado kind of philosophy that you're a victim instead of a promulgator. But I want to leave on a note of hope, if I could. Ulysses Grant in his memoir talks about being part of Winfield Scott's army that comes to Mexico City in 1847. And he has a passage in it, I think this is after the Battle of the San Cosmos Gate, in which he says that the Mexican soldier, the individual Mexican soldier, is every bit the equal of every one of the American soldiers. So they're just as brave, they're just as patriotic, they're just as valorous as any soldier from the United States. And for Grant, who is obviously from the Midwest, never been outside the country, this is a revelation, and he has tremendous respect. But he says the flaw in the Mexican state is that their leadership is the worst he's ever seen. So you have a people of valor led by men who are anything but. And that seems to be the case now. So I totally agree with my colleagues here, Alice especially. Education's the key. Changing that is a cultural work of generations. But I'm glad you asked that question. Thank you, because to me it's at the core of it. But can I get a round of applause for our panelists who've shared their time and their talent? And all of whom do intrepid work in Mexico itself. Thank you. Just an admin note, the next panel will convene at 2:35, so take a break, get some coffee, speak amongst yourselves, and we'll be back with the broadest aperture of all what's happening in the Western Hemisphere. Thanks so much.
I haven't been on this side yet. Sit down front. Yeah, all right. Rock concert. Well, we'd like to get started here with the next panel. If I could have our august audience take their seats, including the joker out there who thinks he is at a rock concert or something. I've never had that accusation before, but you know, if my children heard that, they might actually think I was cool for a millisecond. I'm Chuck DeVore. I'm the Chief National Initiatives Officer for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Welcome to our next panel here this afternoon. I think you're going to find this a very interesting panel as we're going to go into kind of a regional overview of what's happening in the Western Hemisphere south of the border. And I think you'll find a few interesting revelations. I'm joined here by two panelists, and frankly, I'm really glad that I have two panelists because one of my panelists caught COVID, which is still a thing, and the other got a really bad cold and was unable to travel and might even have COVID as well. So I'm wondering if there's some Chinese biolab somewhere down in Panama that might be trying to mess with our presentation. So I'm joined, and for those of you who have military background, this is a joint panel. I'm joined by Joseph Humeyer, and we'll have a little more to discuss about his name in a moment. He's the executive director at the Center for a Secure, Free Society and a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy. Joseph is a former Marine. Hoorah. Hoorah. Yeah, you can see I say that with a lot of enthusiasm as a retired Army officer. He saw combat in Iraq. He's a national security expert specializing in trans-regional threats in the Western Hemisphere, such as international terrorism, transnational organized crime, China, Russia, and Iran's malign influence. Joining Joseph and myself, we have Rodrigo Arenas. He's an entrepreneur, publisher, journalist, and Republican values advocate. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of Republica, an Ibero-American media company based in Guatemala that defends Republican values of life, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. He's also the co-founder and president of the Movimiento Cívico Nacional in Guatemala, which started in 2009. This is a nonprofit organization that promotes informed, active, and responsible citizen participation in national issues. I wish we had more of that here as well. Most importantly, he's married to his wife Sophia and is the father of 6 children, which kind of makes you wonder either A, how he has time to run the Republica, or conversely, maybe that's why he does run it, because it gets him out of the house. So before we formally start here, Humeyer.
That's right.
Yeah, it's not really Humeyer though, is it?
So it depends which side of the border you're on. Because, no, we were talking about this earlier. So I spent 8 years in the Marine Corps. And I think, everyone who has either served in the military, it changes your life. I think it's definitely an experience that kind of transforms you, especially as a young adult. But my last name actually comes from South America. My family's from Bolivia. But actually, the name doesn't come from Bolivia. It comes from Peru, and it's pronounced Umire. But if you could get a sergeant major of the Marine Corps to say Umire, you're a better Marine than me. So it ended up turning into Humeyer in the Marine Corps, and colloquially, I was known as Sergeant Humvee. So it was even more colloquial.
Yeah, that's. I think it's still better than what the drill sergeants would often call me. Is that usually Devore turned into Devour, followed by maniacal laughing with the head thrown back. Like that. What the heck are you going to do? You can't say anything back.
No, I mean, especially not in boot
right?
camp.
No, you end up doing push-ups.
Yeah,
right, you learn very quickly. So let's start off, if we can, with, after we've gotten this levity out of the way now, what the heck is happening in South America where we see an entire region where it now seems that governments that respect property rights, that respect rule of law, are now in the minority?
Yeah.
What's happening? What's going on there? And what does that mean for the United States and for our national security?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things. I mean, let me begin by this. I think in terms of U.S. foreign policy, I think the largest failure of U.S. foreign policy has been Latin America. We haven't had a policy for the region for decades. You could argue maybe President Reagan had a policy, but it was mostly for Central America, and it was to push back the Soviet Union and to fight communism. But since that period, since the end of the Cold War, we pretty much had kind of a hands-off approach to Latin America, and a vacuum was created. And in that vacuum, as vacuums tend to do, it began to get filled, primarily by China, but also by Russia and also Iran. China, let me touch on that a little bit, because that's really a South America phenomenon, is moving up north. The story of China and Latin America is a story of malign intent and U.S. neglect. And I spoke a little bit about the neglect part. But the malign intent is China sold a bunch of smoke to Latin America, thinking that they were just going to engage in trade and commerce and business relationships. But anyone that knows anything about China, and even I would say including the United States, because I think we had a misread on China for decades as well, until the 2017 National Security Strategy corrected that. But China sold this idea that they're just coming to Latin America to buy commodities, to engage in trade, to help develop their economies, and that they have one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America, in the world. So they wanted to as the bigger the country goes, the more they have to eat. But the truth of that is, that's done. China's economy is now contracting. They have a housing crisis. They have a currency crisis. So they're not going to be able to spend that money. But all the time, when they were buying up these commodities from Latin America, it wasn't to grow their economy. It was to grow their defense industry. So today, what are we seeing in South America? So Latin America is the home of the largest space infrastructure that China has in the world, right? There's 3 deep space satellite stations that China has in the world. 2 are on mainland. 1 is in Neuquén, Argentina, in the south of South America. They have 11 satellite tracking stations as a whole. And now if you ask China, they say that's to explore what they call the far side of the moon, deep space exploration. But in reality, they're not scientific explorers. They're not trying to create another NASA. What they're trying to do is track satellites in orbit to shoot them down. They also have more than 40 port infrastructure projects in Latin America. They're the major developer for port infrastructure. And in that, if you look at the corporate records and the corporate registries of many of these companies, Chinese state-owned companies like Hutchison Whampoa or like Costco Shipping, they're PLA offshoots. They are service providers for the PLA. They're the same port holding companies that built the South China Sea. So what China did is they created what they call a true Pacific strategy. One side of the Pacific is the Pacific Islands, South China Sea, East China Sea. But we always forget that the other side of the Pacific is the Western Hemisphere, all the way up from Canada down to Argentina. So China has been carefully, systematically looking at that part of the world and finding an endpoint, a destination. Right now it's trade, right now it's businesses, but soon it'll be aircraft carriers, it'll be submarines, and it's a true warfare strategy.
So Rodrigo, Joseph hinted at some of the challenges with regards some of these transnational threats to American national security. You particularly have studied and focused on the civic aspects of you could say virtue, right? In other words, self-government, rule of law, citizens holding their governments accountable. Could you provide us some of your perspective on, is there hope, right? What nations in South and Central America do you see still have enough of a check or enough of a civic culture that we can see some sort of a renaissance or a recovery of government that's not as corrupt, right? That follows the will of the people.
Wow. I would say none, but at the same time, I would hope all of them. What's happening in Latin America, it's cultural, like Alicia and Jessica said it before with Mexico. The biggest difference between Latin America and the US is how we were conquered, or by whom we were conquered. The Latin America, there's a very good book, a little bit leftist, but very good book, by the way, called Why Nations Fail, which I believe has a very good diagnostic about it, and is the design of our institutions. Our institutions are designed for privileges, extractive, based on privileges, instead of inclusive, based on incentives, like the US institutions used to be. I'm not sure that they're still staying that way. And this all comes from, when you go to smarter people than me, they explain you why it's the difference between the countries that were conquered by Spain and have the French Revolution influence, and the countries that were conquered by England and have the Glorious Revolution influence, where you defend the individual rights above the common good. In our countries, we just made a campaign 2 weeks ago, and I'm still suffering the consequences in Guatemala by saying that the individual rights are above or are more important than the common good. People are killing me for it. And why is that? It's because people do not understand what individual rights are. Usually, we understand that until we suffer it individually, when we lose our property, when we lose our liberty directly. But we have heard for too many years that the common good is the most important thing. And nobody really explains us that the common good is a consequence of well-respected and defended individual rights. So going forward 200 years, I believe we need to re-educate our society. We have a huge problem of this very collective society, like Alicia and Jessica said, that everybody's responsible, that the government, the state is responsible for all our goods and problems. And we need to change that. There are some countries that I'm not sure they're going to be able to go back from it, like Argentina, for example. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that a person that is responsible for more than 150% of inflation still gets 10 million votes. That's ridiculous. I was in Argentina at the end of September, and the peso was 750 for $1. 1 month for the election, it was 1,400. Like 50% of the appreciation of their money in 1 month, and they voted for the Minister of Economy that created that. So when you see that, I'm not very hopeful or positive that we have that the region has a future. But on the other side, as Joseph says, the U.S., I wouldn't say forgotten us, because I would love if that really would have happened. But you have certain people in the Department of State that I'm pretty sure they're not the most important people in the Department of State that have a lot of power in our countries. Ridiculous amount of power. And these people usually have, I would say, bad information, misinformation, and they're not exactly the best leaders. And the policies, the few policies that you have in Guatemala or in countries like ours are so bad. There's a question that was made yesterday in the podcast of Melissa and Josh. Somebody asked Melissa if they should cut the U.S. Economic aid to our countries. And she said, no, that would be worse because of this and that. And my answer would be, depends. If you keep sending money the way you're doing it right now, I'd rather if you definitely cut it out, because it's only going to NGO parasites to promote narratives and Marxist agendas. But if you would invest it in, like China is doing, in infrastructure, in critical investments that would really improve our way of life and our capacities of building wealth, that will be another thing. So yes, the U.S. is usually the biggest market for all our countries. I would say even, I don't know, I'm not sure about this, but I would say even Brazil, that I know has a huge trade exchange with China. But I would say that the U.S. is, I think the U.S. is bigger, but it's usually the biggest market for all our countries. But not only that, the power that the U.S. has, the example, which you're losing every day with the actual policies. But the power and the capability that the U.S. has to have influence, either bad or good, in our countries is huge.
Rodrigo, I keep thinking about the fact that I think I own a 1.5 million Argentinian peso suit, and I'm feeling kind of special right now.
1.5 million from yesterday or from today?
We'll have to, yes, that could be a problem. Joseph, if you, taking what Rodrigo was saying as far as the challenge with the politically cultural aspects of this region, and looking at the concerted effort made in the 1980s during the Cold War to try to push back the Soviet Union's advances in Central America, and knowing what you know about both the transnational criminal threat, the terrorist organizations, the inroads by China and Russia and Iran, how do you synthesize that? In other words, how do you look at the threat and then taking things as they are? What would you recommend if, for example, you were named Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, or whatever the proper title is in the State Department?
Yeah, so actually, I'll use that as an opportunity to plug some of the work that they're doing at the Heritage Foundation that I'm involved in. Heritage has this project called Project 2025, which is basically an effort to create a government plan for the transition and then eventually for the next administration focused on policy and personnel. So I'm on the State Department team, and specifically on the Western Hemisphere of the State Department team. And so that exact question is the question that I was tasked with to try to understand. And let's be honest, I mean, if we come back into power and if we have to then tackle these foreign policy challenges, we're going to be the underdog at this point because of what's happened over the last 3.5 years and what could potentially even happen all of next year under the Biden administration. I mean, it's amazing how fast they've been able to essentially destroy the world in just a matter of a few short years. So the question on the Western Hemisphere, and I think this is the key question because we have to define what's north. Right? And so China has a definition. Latin America, and a lot of what Rodrigo's saying, Latin America many of the countries are new to democracy, right? They gained their independence about 200 years ago, most of the countries in the region, but some of them had military dictatorships up until the late 20th century. So they don't fully understand democracy and the democratic experiment, some more than others. And in many respects, that came with kind of a lack of identity. And there are a lot of the countries are struggling to maintain a national identity. And what China's been trying to do is they've been trying to supplant that identity by putting Latin America in what they define as the South. This is kind of their definition of what they call the global south, this south-south network, or that's what they use the Belt and Road Initiative to do. So the way to break a south-south paradigm is through a north-south cooperation, but then you have to redefine what's north. China would have us believe that north begins at the Rio Grande, that literally Mexico is a southern country, and then United States and Canada are northern countries. Historically, demographically, geographically, that's false, right? North has never been defined by landmass, it's been defined by oceans. The North Atlantic and the North Pacific, which control trade, international trade based on maritime security. So if you study the culture of Latin America, and this is going to go a little bit into the depth, but if you study the culture of Latin America, there's only one, or actually two specifically, divisions geographically that have defined culture over thousands of years. One is called an Amazon, and the other is called the Andes Mountains. When you go north to the Andes Mountains, it's literally why the Spanish couldn't go into Brazil, right? Because that's why Brazil was colonized by Portugal and the rest of Latin America mostly by Spain. But when you go to the north of the Andes, the mountains split up into at least two, if maybe not three ranges. And when you go into those ranges of mountains, the indigenous tribes, and this is even pre-Spanish colonization, they all were fractured and fragmented. Which is why today in Venezuela, they'll play baseball. Colombia, they'll listen to U.S. music. And the culture of the north starts at the equator. It literally starts at the equator and moves up. So part of the policy, I think, prescriptions that we need to create is we need to establish an area of cultural affinity for the United States. There is no power in the world that doesn't live within a neighborhood. It's impossible to have a great country and have a ghetto surrounding every single border around you. And it'll eventually include your north, your west, your east, and your south. So my argument is to just reestablish an area of affinity among a north-south relationship where north is no longer defined just by Mexico, US, and Canada, but defined all the way out to what was called the Spanish Main of Colombia, Guyana, Ecuador, Venezuela, who culturally, demographically, historically, and geographically are more close to the United States than they are to Argentina or they are to Chile. And then we have to work in the south. And the south, I mean, Chile is like more European. They're German, basically. They're like German with Spanish accents. And Argentina are Italian, right? Brazil is Portuguese. So we have to work with those countries to build this cooperation and break that south-south paradigm that China is trying to impose upon the world and particularly upon the Western Hemisphere. That's why the border is so important, because the border is that dividing line that China is trying to make. I'll give you this anecdote. In March of this year, the Russian, probably the second most powerful man in Russia, right, is Nikolai Patrushev. He's pretty much the number two to Vladimir Putin. If Vladimir Putin would fall off a rooftop, Nikolai Patrushev will be in charge. So Patrushev travels to Latin America, goes to Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. As he's traveling to Latin America, the Russian Foreign Ministry launches a disinformation campaign. I'm going to actually read to you what they said in their X accounts, Twitter accounts, whatever it's called nowadays. They quoted Nikolai Patrushev, and they said, quote, this is the Russian Foreign Ministry, "There is no doubt sooner or later the southern neighbors of the United States will recover the territories that were stolen from them." This is the Russian government saying this, and they drew a map of 1821 with a new border that covered Arizona, New Mexico, parts of California, and Texas. Now, we take that as disinformation and propaganda. The Russians do this is what they do. But nonetheless, what they're fundamentally trying to do is, through migration, through drugs, through terrorism, is implant a new community and a new identity for the southern states of the United States to eventually take this over. And there's a part of Latin America that they've already done this. It's Colombia. They actually already did this to Colombia and Venezuela. The worst border in the Western Hemisphere is not our southern border, it's the Colombia and Venezuela border, where they systematically use drugs, migrants, and terrorists to collapse that border. And then when you started the state basically became overwhelmed and started losing their capacity to control the border, the cartel started taking over. But it really wasn't the cartel that we were concerned about, because over time, what you start seeing, what you see today on the Colombia-Venezuela border is Russian radar systems, Iranian drones, Chinese satellite tracking stations. So that's why I use that Russian example, because we talk a lot, and I think I was Mark, I heard talk earlier today, the defense hawks on the Hill, they want to talk mostly about the conflicts overseas, Ukraine war, the war against Israel in Gaza, what could potentially happen with Taiwan, and then the border hawks are talking about, well, we need to take care of our southern border. Well, they're actually both right, because it's both part of the same problem. 100%, you're not going to be able to engage in all these conflicts around the world with a wide open border, because it'll steal your will to fight. But nonetheless, the people that are attacking those borders in other parts of the world are the same people that are attacking the U.S. southern border today.
Rodrigo, something that hasn't been mentioned much yet in this conversation is the role of Mexico, right? Obviously, America is not the sole actor in this region, and we don't just act against nations that are not in our hemisphere, China, Iran, Russia. To what degree have you seen, whether in Guatemala or in your broader observations of the Western Hemisphere, what have you seen insofar as Mexico's increasing role in helping to bridge, for example, influence from areas like Cuba or Russia or China into the Southern Hemisphere? Do you see that much in Guatemala, and do you observe that in the rest of the Southern Hemisphere?
I wouldn't see that officially, but I do see it in the drug cartels, which at the end of the day are the most multinational structures we have. And when you get Colombia, Mexico, and United States, the drug cartels are the best, I would say, the best organized organizations. And usually all these chaos that are generated differently in every country, the primary benefactors of that chaos are the drug cartels. You have it in when you have the coyotes moving people. Usually they move it with something else. For example, when you have areas in each country that the state doesn't have any presence, or that, well, they manage to manipulate or buy or whatever indigenous groups, usually they work for the drug cartels. For example, in Guatemala, we have an area called Polo Chic that the drug cartels pay about $200,000 to the group of indigenous people that protects their landing strips. But what they do first is that they promote an invasion of that land, arguing ancestral ownership or whatever. But usually these are movements. So when you get, for example, right now the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Nación, something like that, it's becoming very powerful in Guatemala, and it comes, of course, from Jalisco. So I would say, and listening to what I've heard in the last 2-3 panels, at the end of the day, these cartels are somehow even sometimes promoted. And a government like Morena, when you listen to Petro in Colombia, when you see how friendly López Obrador is in Mexico with the drug cartels, that's not coincidence. That's not coincidence. And when you see that the biggest is the drug money, is that they are the biggest financiers of Maduro, and the amount of power that it has, I would say I really don't think that's a coincidence. So I would say that's the way Mexico it's influencing.
So Joseph, you had mentioned briefly talking about focus of foreign policy experts on places like the Russian war against Ukraine or the Hamas-Israel war, concerns over Taiwan. Following on something that Rodrigo was talking about with these international drug cartels, there's an organization that's actually both. They both deal in drugs and they are terrorist organizations. Can you tell the audience a little bit about the tri-border area? What is the tri-border area? What is Hezbollah doing there? And as some of you may have seen in the news, just in the last 24 hours, there were, I think, 2 members of Hezbollah that were arrested in Brazil that were potentially planning to do some pretty significant anti-Jewish violence in Brazil that were just fortunately arrested before they could carry out their plans. So tell the audience a little bit, what what do you mean by the tri-border area? What is that? And what is Hezbollah doing there? And how is it somehow connected with some of this lawlessness or the drug trade?
Okay, yeah, no, I'll address that operation that just took place in Brazil, and then actually I want to see if I could capitalize on that to talk a little about the transformation of transnational organized crime. So what you're referring to is there was an operation this morning where the Brazilian Federal Police arrested actually 11 individuals that were involved in potential terror plots in Brazil. So more than a month ago, on October 11th, I believe, is a little bit after the attack from Hamas into Israel, there was an alert put out in Brazil that the Department of Defense communicated to say that they're looking at increased traffic and activity along this area of South America called the tri-border area. It's pretty much in the south of South America. It's the intersection between Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. It's a hotbed for Hezbollah financial activity, terror plotting. The largest Islamist terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere prior to September 11th happened in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and it actually happened twice, in 92 and 94, where they blew up the Israeli embassy in 92 and then a Jewish cultural center in 94, killing collectively 114 people. And that whole terrorist attack was hatched in the tri-border area. So it's a hub for this type of activity. And so they've been monitoring. It's called Operation Trapiche. It's the operation that took place today. And they were able to find, because I think an individual flew in either yesterday or early this morning from Lebanon specifically to Sao Paulo. And they, apparently, according to what people have told me, that some sensitive sources in Brazil, that he was carrying out the instructions for carrying out this attack. I can tell you that Brazil is not isolated in this. I know about at least 4 or 5 other countries that are monitoring the same movements, similar plots, similar activity in Latin America. Now, let me use that as a segue to talk about Hezbollah's role in transnational organized crime. So in 2018, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, he did something that many people didn't pay attention to. He created kind of like a top 5 of transnational criminal organizations that are targets of United States law enforcement through the Department of Homeland Security. He named 3 major Mexican cartels, right? The Sinaloa, Jalisco Nueva Generaciones, and at the time it was the Gulf Cartel. He mentioned MS-13, the very brutal gang from Salvador, and the 5th group that he mentioned was Hezbollah. Not as a terrorist group, but he mentioned them as a transnational criminal organization. Why? Because Hezbollah over time has become the major money launderer for all of the cartels from Mexico to Colombia down to Brazil. They're known as sort of a Federal Express, a Western Union for the cartels to move their merchandise into Africa, Middle East, and mostly into Europe or into the United States, but more importantly, to launder that through the Lebanese banking system. So this is Hezbollah's role internationally. And over time, they've gotten very adept at that to be able to start to penetrate the governments of Latin America. Many counterterrorism authorities have been co-opted by Hezbollah. Now, let me use that now as a segue to talk a little bit about the transformation of transnational organized crime. And this is very important for, I think, everyone here, that we've heard a lot about the Mexican cartels, and this, I think we've been talking about that pretty much all day. It really, in my opinion, isn't suitable to even call them cartels anymore, because that term actually comes from London, right? It comes from cartelization, it comes from a legal system. And I could say this because my parents are from Bolivia. The first cartel was from Bolivia. It was Roberto Suarez, who he called it the company. He actually studied at the London School of Economics. He adapted the term. He brought it to Bolivia, which is a major producer of the coca paste that turns into cocaine. He actually brought Pablo Escobar down to Bolivia, trained him up, and basically the idea was create your drug enterprise like a company. Structure it like a company with a line and org chart, compartmentalization. That's why the Medellin cartel got so big. And then now you got the Mexicans, but they've adapted since that. That's the old model. And the DEA still hasn't adapted to this new reality, because the DEA strategy is called the kingpin strategy. So they basically cut the head off the snake and they go after these cartels. But today, pretty much since the Zetas, they don't operate in a line and org chart. They went from vertical networks to horizontal networks to what's more equivalent to what's called complex adaptive systems. They've adapted from going into looking at distribution to looking at controlling territory. Like in Ecuador, right? You have the Mexican cartel, Sinaloa, you have mainly Sinaloa, you have some Jalisco in Ecuador, but you have over 11,000 micro cartels, micro trafficking organizations. And what do the Sinaloa do? They provide protection. So that's the service provider. That's what the Zetas was a model, because that was their main comparative advantages. So they no longer work as cartels. They work as complex adaptive systems. They work in a horizontal manner. That's why it's hard to go after kingpins. The number 2 adaptation is a thing called threat convergence. 10, 15, 20 years ago, after 9/11, there was a huge debate in the Department of Defense that I was involved in, where they said that terrorists, Islamist terrorists particularly, would never work with cartels or transnational criminal organizations. Why? Because one is motivated by political grievances, the other one is motivated by profits. Like, you're not going to have a cartel that's just going to abandon their seek for profit to go after a jihadist cause, or vice versa. They were almost right. Yes, at the strategic level, you don't have cartels just taking off their business model and just saying we're going to start, going after jihadist causes. But what you saw was a union between the two in the area of logistics. If you're a service provider, if you're an accountant for a Sinaloa cartel and Hezbollah comes into Mexico, you're a good candidate to be an accountant for Hezbollah as well. So what we started to see was the real area of growth in transnational organized crime was in the service providers, the fixers, the financiers, the facilitators. They're the glue, and they linked drugs to terrorism, to proliferation, and fundamentally, the last adaptation that I wanted to talk about was that that's when it started to bleed into illicit economies that started to capture states. So this is the concept of criminalized states. And so this is different than corruption. This is different than a narco state. We've had narco states in Latin America forever. Everyone remembers Manuel Noriega in Panama. We actually invaded that country because of a dictator that was tied to drug trafficking. But what we're seeing today is beyond Manuel Noriega, Panama, in a narco state. What we're seeing is a criminalized state, because instead of having corruption breed into the government of any of these countries, capturing positions of power and using it for the benefit of transnational criminal organizations, what you have is the government using its government power to embed into the organ of transnational organized crime so that the government becomes, quote unquote, the cartel. Venezuela is that. Venezuela uses its immigration system, its banking system, its transportation system, everything that a government would use to deter threats, it uses them to amplify threats. And I'm going to present one to you today. I venture to guess that many people haven't heard of this, but this is probably one of the biggest, fastest growing transnational criminal organizations, growing way faster than the Mexican cartels, and it's from Venezuela. It's called the Tren de Aragua. It literally called the train from Aragua. And it was based out of a prison in Aragua, in the northern Caribbean state in Venezuela. And it's basically become a specialist in human smuggling and human trafficking, sex trafficking, child trafficking, but most importantly, the movement of migrants. And over the span of about less than 5 years, they've gone to being a small prison, a small transnational criminal organization based out of a prison in Venezuela. They're now having presence in 7 or 8 countries throughout the hemisphere. Wherever you see a Venezuelan diaspora community, the Tren de Aragua will follow. And they're in Mexico. They're in Mexico, and they're coming to Texas. Venezuela was once the most of the migration was going south. The largest migration in the world, 7.7 million Venezuelans fleeing that country since 2014, larger than Syria, larger than Ukraine, 2 war zones. That was flooding South America first, but since 2021, that's been moving north. And today, that's the #1 source country of all the apprehensions and encounters on the U.S. southern border. That means the Tren de Aragua is following right behind them. And the Tren de Aragua, to me, no one believes the official story that there was some young guy named Nino Guerrero that created this multinational transnational criminal organization in a matter of 5 years. That's a state-sponsored transnational criminal organization. That's what Hezbollah is for Iran. This is for Venezuela. And I think that's something that, to me, that amorphous is a transnational organized crime.
You mentioned Panama and Manuel Noriega. My first day of active duty with Southcom J2 was my getting carjacked by one of Noriega's Dignity Battalion goons. And so it made me about 10 minutes late to my first day of active duty. And about 11 months later, the neighborhood in which that happened was burned to the ground by the American invasion. So it was like, yeah, I have a bit of a familiarity with that area. Rodrigo, you were
I was going to say retaliation for the carjacking.
Yes, I was one of the incidents that led to the invasion. So yes, I don't know. I doubt I was the straw that broke the camel's back, though. Rodrigo, in listening to this kind of litany of terribles that we've discussed, when you think forward and you think of a proactive American effort to try to recapture some of this region, this very important region for obviously for America and for Americans, North and South America, what do you see as the essential elements? You previously mentioned investment. You talked about U.S. foreign aid and how if it continues to go to, I think you use the term something like worthless NGOs or kind of the status quo versus infrastructure investments. Could you expand a little bit about what you would see as a successful strategy for the U.S. to re-engage actively with this region of the world?
Well, when I was coming here on Sunday, my brother-in-law asked me. I was first coming to Miami, then coming here, and he asked me where I was going, and I said to him that I was coming to this meeting, that this group was forming in order to do Project 2025 and the policy for when the Republicans win next year. And he says, "Oh, so it's like a prayer group." Yes. First, you need to win next year. That's a must. That's definitely a must. I don't know what's going to happen to the region if we don't have a 180 degrees change in your Department of State from next year. And why am I saying that is because you see Guatemala, Honduras, now El Salvador, Panama, countries that used to be, for example, when you want to see a country in Latin America, how the country plays the game, see where that country stands for Taiwan and or Israel. And Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador were countries that were for Taiwan until, well, Salvador and Honduras 2 years ago. Guatemala is still in the side of Taiwan, but I'm not sure that's going to be because the left, a left politician just won the elections, and he's taking over, and he's positioning, how do you say, taking position? Taking power on January. So the U.S. needs to address, I would say, Latin America and Latin American countries like its true partners, like true partners that if the U.S. can help us the way, for example, you did it with Europe after the Second World War, in generating the infrastructure, in generating the basics that we need to really become countries that developing countries and not third world countries, I would say that would change a lot of the minds. As always, it's like right now, I wouldn't say, with some exceptions in some countries, I would say it's a very small amount of people that are doing all the damage in the Department of State and in each and every country. And it's the same amount and it's the same small amount of people that can do the benefit or that can change the way we're going. And I would say it's on two issues I would go. One, infrastructure. It's ridiculous the lack of infrastructure that we have in Latin America. And second, I don't know how, but the rule of law, that equality under the law. You know what I mean? It's not only the rule of law by itself, but also how we need to redesign our institutions in order to be inclusive based on incentives. And then when I say inclusive, it's universal institutions. It's institutions that are good for white, for black, for brown, for yellow, for whatever persons, for every individuals. I would say, because when you go to these countries, usually the people are hardworking people, are people that want to succeed, to be better, to have success in their lives and their families. And one of the biggest things I think we still have is that we're family-based countries. We're still family-based countries. And that's one value that we have to protect, because I think that's the value that when you still have that value, you can still reshape the whole country and you can still reshape society. When you lose the value, when you lose the family-based value in society, I don't know if there's a way back from there.
Joseph, Rodrigo talked about rule of law, and I know that there's a lot of corporations, for example, that are engaging in kind of this euphemistic term that they call de-risking, right, where they're trying to get out of China because, of course, in China, as with some other countries, repatriating your earnings can be difficult, right? Converting your profits in the local currency into dollars and realizing some profit. And so part of the challenge in relocating, let's say, factory operations from China to, let's say, Guatemala is that in China, of course, the Chinese Communist Party could decide tomorrow to take all of your stuff and they could do it, right? But that probably isn't necessarily not the case in Guatemala either, right? That you could find yourself nationalized. So if you look at that, if you look at the potential for hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. investment that as factory equipment begins to age and as artificial intelligence and automation begins to come online, do you see an opportunity for a significant shift in global supply chains that the United States depends on going from China to the Western Hemisphere? And what are the potential roadblocks that might cause major businesses to be hesitant, and how can we overcome them?
The opportunity, Chuck, exists. It's there, but it needs leadership. It's not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen just through kind of organic business-to-business relationship. It needs political leadership first, I think, here from the United States, also in Latin America. There are plenty of opportunities. The United States, we kick China's butt every day on capital markets. Where we lose is on government-to-government trade, right? That's where China does very well because they run towards corruption. The United States tends to try to run away from it. But I think to what Rodrigo was saying, and this is, got me thinking a little bit, is in the essence of like what's taking place in Latin America, the rule of law, right? That's been the challenge probably throughout the world, certainly in Latin America, like how to promote the rule of law, how to build essentially a culture of citizens that actually respect the legal frameworks of their country. Well, that's fundamentally being challenged in ways we haven't seen in a long time in Latin America. The big battle in the region today, there's probably about 4 consolidated autocratic states in Latin America: Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. Those have no rule of law. Those countries are pretty much electoral autocracies or kind of dictatorships, if you will. But the rest of the region, they're trying to capture those countries, but they're not only trying to capture the executive, they're trying to capture the judicial. Brazil is that case, actually. Brazil is living right now kind of under a judicial dictatorship, right? Lula da Silva is a communist sympathizer, China, whatever. But the magistrates, the Supreme Court in Brazil is literally silencing and shutting down the entire opposition, whoever basically dissents with whatever their opinions are. Right now, you have ongoing battles in Guatemala and Honduras and Europe and Ecuador, in Colombia, in Peru, the battles over the Attorney General's office, to capture the Attorney General's office, to capture the courts. And so if they're successful in that, we're going to see an element of lawfare. Essentially, you're going to see laws being used to go after persecution of opposition and to embody and embellish the parts of the private sector that are closer to the authoritarian allies. Earlier today in one of the panels, they were talking...
Wait a minute. Are you talking about the Biden? No, you're not talking about that. Okay, never
well, no,
mind.
but I see that bleeds into the United States, right? Like what I'm describing to you from Latin America, but you can make that position juxtaposed with what's going on here in the United States, and I don't think it's different. In fact, I was having a conversation with Simon from the Heritage Foundation for a podcast that we put out, and he said something I thought was very telling. He said, for the longest time, we've been going to Latin America and telling them to emulate the United States, and what's happened over time is the reverse. We ended up emulating the worst parts of Latin America with our judicial system, lack of rule of law, lack of integrity on our elections, and things like that. And then so I want to touch a little bit on someone, Rodrigo. He's mentioned the State Department a couple of times, and I was involved in some of these conversations. And there's been this kind of mindset for most of the, I would call them the bureaucracy that deals with Latin America, whether it's state, treasury, defense, or, the executive branch. And it's been kind of this mindset that we have to do what the Latin Americans want, right? We have to listen to our partners, listen to our friends, and they'll guide us and tell us what we need to do. I think that's a very weak position to take. America stands for something. America has a certain set of values. We have a history. We shouldn't be shy of that. We've made mistakes all throughout the world. We've made mistakes in Latin America, but you can't let those mistakes hold you back from actually promoting that you are something that's different than what the rest of the world is promoting, because China comes to Latin America and they try to promote something very specific. And I, I remember I was in one of these conversations, like, but Joseph, we don't want to make them choose. I'm like, no, yeah, we do. We want to make them choose, And is you want to work with China, you go to China, but there will be consequences for that. There's empirical consequences for working with China, and there's also going to be other consequences in terms of how you engage the United States. It makes no sense that we continue to give credits, loans, and investments to countries that use those credits, loans, and investments to couple that to only give the money to China. I'll give you a quick little story on that, just 2 seconds. The Inter-American Development Bank, the largest lending institution for Latin America, mini World Bank for Latin America, right? In 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, IDB was the most poorly run multilateral institution. They lost $1 billion in the red. So they go to the United States, 40% shareholder for a capitalization, the recapitalization of the bank. We were bailing out other banks. We didn't have that in our priority. And so what happens? China comes in. They came in at 0.004%, minority shareholder. They probably didn't spend no more than $20 million to become part of the bank. But they paid, for the first time ever in the history of the 60-year multilateral institution, they paid what's called an entrance fee. You can guess what that entrance fee was. It was close to $1 billion. So they created an institutional kickback to buy out the Inter-American Development Bank, the largest lending institution in all of Latin America. And since 2010, China's Export Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank have been matching their credits and loans to Latin America. We're 40% shareholder of this. So it's not an exaggeration to say that we co-finance. The United States co-finance China's rise in Latin America. These are the kind of policy mistakes we cannot afford. We cannot be continuing to make this. So I'm of the mind, I think, is we need to go back to Latin America and we need to have an assertive policy. We need to say we stand for something. We stand for a set of values and we stand for a set of ideals of what we want to accomplish. And I don't think we have to be afraid of that.
I would just like to add, I agree with Joseph, but I would do something first. And I would try to discover, motivate, and capacitate leaders that believe in the Republican values. The problem right now that you have in most Latin American leaders, even the right-wing leaders, is that they truly believe that democracy is above the republic as a system, that collectivism is above the individual rights. So they make a lot of decisions believing that if those decisions are popular, then they're right decisions. For example, right now you can see it in El Salvador, how Bukele is reelecting, he's gonna reelect himself. He's violating the constitution of El Salvador, but nobody cares because it's popular. And so we need to understand, because those are the types of values that have made America, the US, so great for the last 240, 50 years. So I would say one thing that I would do before is I would create the leaderships. I would try to discover, to understand, to identify the possible leaders that you can have in every country, and capacitate them and help them and help them get to power and help them, because then you're going to have smart decisions. The problem right now is that you go to most of our countries and the right-wing leaders, they don't have the capacity to look beyond a meter out of themselves.
Well, there's a lot of sobering things to think about with this panel. We've come to the time where we'd like to hear from you, our audience, with some questions and answers. And I think the most important thing about the questions is make sure it ends in a question mark. We do have some microphones around the room, so please put up your hand if you wish to ask a question. And if you will, let us know who you are and if you're with an affiliation, what that is, and then ask your question. Yes, sir.
Terrific panel. Phil Linderman from the Center for Immigration Studies. So really, Joseph, you had a great critique, but I think the Biden administration would say they do have a policy for Latin America. It's in the Los Angeles Declaration of Migration and Protection. And Tony Blinken and the rest of the State Department are all about making sure that migrants can move in the hemisphere. 20 million migrants are supposed to be on the move in the hemisphere, and this is supposed to be a good thing. So what do we say back to Blinken, the Biden administration? They say they have a policy, and it's working great.
No, I don't think we have to say, we just have to get him out of office. That's 100% what we need to do. I mean, so about the migration issue, you're right. And I've had this conversation with some folks in Washington, because there is this thinking that they don't have a priority in Latin America, or they're incompetent, they don't know what they're doing. But it depends which angle you take, because I think they're accomplishing everything that they want to do. I think Rodrigo talked a little bit about what they're doing in Guatemala, but they essentially have decided to cherry pick specific leaders in specific countries to prop them up because they have radical leftist progressive Marxist values. You know, they used it under the banner of anti-corruption. They have this kind of anti-corruption jihad that they're waging in Latin America. And nobody's in favor of corruption. There's corruption all around. But guess what? Corruption's been around a long time in Latin America. And when you sanction the vice president of Paraguay, and he's no friend, he's a guy, 30s.
And in the U.S. too.
Sure. And you know, of course, no country's pervious to corruption. I mean, this is, and that thing, the larger your government grows, the more corrupt it'll become. That's why I think we're mostly all small government proponents here. But when you sanction the vice president of Paraguay, who is no friend specifically to me because he's connected to Hezbollah, oh, my phone, my microphone. I think my battery's out. So. Thank you. But you don't sanction the vice president of Argentina, who's been not just indicted but convicted of stealing over $1 billion in public works project. Why? Because she's a leftist leader running in an election that they want to propel into power in a very important country like Argentina. Then everybody takes you as a joke. And then one last thing on the migration issue. Everything that's happening with the migration issue in a U.S. southern border, none of it is organic. Right? They talk about root causes. We've had root causes in Latin America forever. High levels of insecurity, low levels of economic growth. This is a level of migration that is unprecedented in the history of the Western Hemisphere, and it's happening by design. There's a concept, weaponized migration you guys have all heard of, but there's a concept that's been used in academic literature of how migration has been used more than 80 times since the 1951 UN Refugee Convention as a weapon of coercion. Now, I would argue that we've even evolved to the point that migration is now using as a weapon of warfare. We saw it on the Belarus-Poland border in 2021, and we're seeing it today on the U.S. southern border. But who's the weaponizer? And I mean, you could look at all the autocratic nations, but the one I'm going to pinch you to is the one I was talking about a second ago, is Venezuela. Venezuela has figured out, using a bunch of case studies from the past, how you can use migration to collapse borders. The first time I started to wrestle with this was in 2018 with the Central American caravans. Those caravans were organized primarily by NGOs in Honduras, and one in particular called Pueblos Sin Fronteras, People Without Borders in Spanish. That NGO was financed, supported, and logistically created by Venezuela. That's the same NGO that's right now in Mexico organizing that caravan that's pushing up north. So we have to kind of separate what's considered organic migration because of socioeconomic problems or levels of insecurity from weaponized migration, which I think is currently what we're seeing today on the southern border.
If I could just extend that question and ask you, Joseph, because I recall hearing during some of the trips that the Texas Public Policy Foundation organized to the border that Venezuela today, for a certain sum of money, if you're in country for 48 hours, they'll essentially sell you a passport.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're, for example, from a country known for terrorism, because I know we've had, over 150 people that were from, known or suspected terrorists that we've apprehended on the southern border. So let's say you're coming from Lebanon and you don't want to raise flags immediately. You can stop over in Venezuela for 48 hours and buy a Venezuelan passport. Is that true?
You don't always have to buy it. There is some of that in terms of, so there was a scheme that was created in 2008 by a Venezuelan then Minister of Interior who turned out to be one of the most powerful people in the history of that country. He turned out to be, later was the vice president, he was a governor, he was the Minister of Petroleum. But early on, at the tender age of only 38 years old, he was the Minister of Interior. His name is Tarek El Aissami, a very Venezuelan name. And he used the Ministry of Interior, which is in charge of the migration, to create a scheme to basically document terrorists. And this is not just selling. This is actually, they would provide members and facilitators of Hezbollah, Hamas, and other terrorist groups from the Middle East with documentation to give them a brand new identity. It wasn't just a passport. It was a bank record, a property record, a driver's license, a national ID card.
Full service.
Full service, full suite of records. For anyone that's worked in intelligence, that's a dream come true to have another government legitimize your fake identity. And so in 2017, with the Trump administration, I argued that we should put Venezuela under the countries of SIA, Special Interest Aliens. Had we done that back then, the conversation today about the U.S. southern border wouldn't be SIAs as a minority. It would be the majority of migrants that are coming to the southern border are SIAs. So Venezuela, that's what I was talking about earlier about this criminalized state. It's beyond corruption and narco states. It's when the government becomes the criminal actor themselves. I think Mexico is in that direction. That's the difference between AMLO and the narco state that Mexico has been ever since the cartel of Guadalajara. They've been a narco state for a very long time. What AMLO did is he consolidated the security apparatus. He brought them under one umbrella in the executive, and he started to embed them with organized crime. And one last point, Chuck, just on the Venezuelan migration north, because the only reason that migration is now happening post-2021 to our southern border now is because Maduro did two things. He augmented and amplified the NGOs that were passing through the Darien Gap to create the infrastructure to move what used to only move less than 100, now move thousands. And he created national flights from Venezuela to Mexico. So he created an air bridge into Mexico, a land bridge to the Darien Gap, and reconfigured the migration that was going south to push north. And they did it in a very calculated way.
Yeah, that's okay, though, because Biden needs that Venezuelan oil on the international market and in exchange for the promise of free and fair elections, right? Yeah, I believe that one. A question back here.
Gentlemen, Nick Geranius, General Counsel with Prospera. I wanted to get your general thoughts. One of the things that I've encountered in our work in Honduras, where we have a special economic zone with about 1,000 acres, is demoralization among well-meaning people throughout the elites, the middle class, and the poor. They just don't think they can do it anymore. And then they look at the United States and they see a change in the way that we display our principles, and they get even more demoralized. And so this is something that I've seen for the past 5 years, and it has underscored to me the importance of being able to visibly deliver the benefits of Republican thinking quickly in short time frames so that people can feel that they can do it again. And that's our business model. We deploy all of the best policies developed in the think tank world in the United States in a zone, and we invite everyone in to prove their merit, and then we let it go. So what do you think of that model of developing, deeper form special economic zones where the best policy ideas from a Republican point of view can be quickly deployed? You open the doors to everyone in that country to prove that it works.
No, I think that is the model. Democracy has to deliver results. If democracy doesn't deliver results, Latin America is going to move away from democracy. You're already starting to see that today. I think Rodrigo alluded to this. What Latin Americans respect more than the ideal of democracy is order. They want order. They want sovereignty. The minute they fought for sovereignty for hundreds of years, the minute you start to steal their sovereignty or take away their order, they will abandon democracy for someone else that will install that order back again. That's why Bukele is so popular in El Salvador. Now, we all know that he's doing an autocratic project, but he's also trying to deliver results, and that's the manipulation of that could be very dangerous. I think whatever projects like the project in Honduras, Prospera, or any other project in the region that would actually deliver results to the people and the citizens of that country is going to naturally have a positive effect. The challenge is these are projects that are now becoming targeted by governments that are using legal mechanisms to shut them down, that are coupled by the external actors that are providing them the political cover to do so. And the United States, the international community, is pretty much doing nothing to prevent that from happening.
Rodrigo.
I will also add up that we need not only to win the battle of ideas, but we also need to win the battle of stories. We lose the stories. In narrative, we're very, very bad. We're not capable of telling the stories the way that people are going to feel identified. I know the project, I know one of the owners of the project, and I think it's awesome, but nobody knows about it. Nobody's going to defend it. For Xiomara to shut it down is very easy because nobody defends it. And nobody defends it because nobody knows about it. And if it will be successful, I would say, okay, but nobody knew about it. Nobody was going to know about it. So we do have a huge problem in narrative, a huge problem. And we need to be able to tell the stories in a better way, in a more human, passionate way, for other people to really feel identified with the ideas that we're promoting. Because the problem is we think that the facts are enough, and they are not. They are definitely not enough. So I would say we need to accompany everything with very, very aggressive storytelling.
We're getting down to the last question. I think we only have a couple of minutes left together. So if you have a brief question that you want to ask, yes, over here.
I guess I'd just be curious. A lot of this I'd never heard before, some of the stories that you were saying. Where else should I be getting my news and information to know about what's going on in the southern border?
So the question is, where else should we be getting our news and information?
Well, we just developed a newsletter with the Carvalho Dialogue called GCAN, Greater Caribbean American Region, which is exactly north of the equator, Central America, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and the Caribbean, Mexico and the US, of course. So get subscribed. I would say it's Erica help us maybe distributing and giving people so they can subscribe.
How do we find it?
But that's a very important. You can find it in republica.gt, but the other way is to send it. I would say it's easier if we can send it to everybody, Erica, so you can subscribe to it.
Republica.gt.
Republica.gt is right now it's our newspaper in Guatemala, digital newspaper in Guatemala. But we are newsletter first, so you can subscribe only to the newsletters that are particularly interesting for you.
Where do you go for your news?
Well, actually, it's just funny because
Republica.
I go to the Republica, Guatemala. No, I mean, unfortunately, I get a lot of news that comes to me, so obviously don't seek it too much. But I think Rodrigo's being modest, and I'll kind of use this last closing remarks to make it a statement about what he's done, because we complain a lot about we don't have the information high ground, right? We do that here in the United States too, because the left has taken over many of the media. They put out a specific narrative, and then we find out that these are a bunch of lies. I think one thing to do is to start creating those channels and those mechanisms. So Rodrigo's taken some of his own capital, raised some capital, and created an alternative media structure that's beginning but has the potential to grow, knowing the industry of media and being able to be professional with it. So I honestly think everyone here could create their own media network, their own media apparatus with the technology that exists today. And at SFS, this is something that we had to adapt to. We were that traditional think tank that we wrote policy papers and testified before Congress. And then I realized, I think it was one of our creative directors, he told me, Joseph, 93% of adult internet consumers consume it through videos and don't consume it through reading. And I was like, oh, great.
3-minute videos.
Yeah, so we created a podcast, we created a YouTube channel, and I think that we have to adapt to that new reality. The digital age is amongst us, and if we don't adapt to it, Russia, China, and Iran will, and they're going to create a false reality, a false dichotomy of what exists in the world, revisionist history on steroids, and we're all going to be living under that emperor.
One of the questions that I leave you with, Joseph, is TikTok, for example.
Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah.
You see right now Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Colombia, a lot of Latin American countries having a lot of influence, and it coincides with TikTok. The Chinese are doing something with that? I would guess so.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for my panelists. I thought it was a very illuminating, if occasionally depressing panel. I guess it goes with the topic and the subject matter, right? Thank you so much for your attention and for attending this important discussion about our Western Hemisphere and some of the challenges that it faces. Please give your warm and enthusiastic applause for our panel.
And don't go anywhere. We got some feedback here. Is there anything we can do about that? All right. I can project. You all can exit off stage. So thank you again so much. One more round of applause for our panelists, please. Absolutely fantastic. Really appreciate it. Quite a day. So that was our last panel. I want to close with some final thoughts on why we're here and what we mean to accomplish. This is not just a day of policy conversation. I want to be very clear about that. Everybody talks about January 6, J6. What happened on January 6? I would posit to you that the most important January 6 in American history didn't come in 2021. It came in 1915. But not a lot of people know about it. On January 6, 1915, a group of Carrancista partisans, participants in the Mexican Revolution of the era, who were adherents of the cause of Venustiano Carranza, who was the eventual victor of the revolution, until his general shot him, by the way, but unveiled what they called the Plan de San Diego. It was unveiled. What was interesting about it was that it was unveiled in the town of San Diego, Texas. If you didn't know that there's a town of San Diego, Texas, you're forgiven. It has a single stoplight. I've been through there. It's on the road from Alice to Laredo, and there's no reason to stop there. But San Diego was of course a ranchero community, very deep-rooted descendants of the Nuevo Santander colony. Under Spanish rule, and so in 1915, fired by the Carrancista cause, then unfolding in the violence of the Mexican Revolution, these gentlemen decided, under the leadership of a man named Agustin Garza, decided to bring the revolution to South Texas and reclaim the lands lost in the war of 1846 to 1848. For the Mexican nation. And so they issued the Plan de San Diego, and the Plan de San Diego was not a moderate document. I won't read the whole thing to you, it's quite long, but here's two relevant passages. The Plan de San Diego, of course, would involve an insurrection, a rebellion of the Mexicans in South Texas, the ethnic Mexicans in South Texas, and here's what they proposed to do. Every North American Anglo under 16 years of age, over 16 years of age, shall be put to death. They were going to kill the entire male population. And only the aged men, women, and children shall be respected, and on no account shall the traitors to our race be spared or respected. So they were going to shoot all the male Anglos, 16 and older, and any Mexican American, any ethnic Mexican who cooperated with them in the name of simple humanity would themselves be killed. Furthermore, prisoners shall not be taken. Instead, they shall be, quote, shot immediately without any pretext. It was to be a war of extermination. Proclaimed on January 6, 1916, the Plan de San Diego. Well, what do you think the Texas authorities did? They dispatched the Rangers and took care of business. And yet, at the same time, there was a disbelief initially among the authorities within the state government of Texas that such a thing could happen. The Saturday Evening Post, in its August 12, 1916 issue, reported that one of the initial revolutionaries who was caught perpetrating an act of violence, they don't specify what, was hauled before a local magistrate in Jim Hogg County, Texas, and the magistrate decided that he was criminally insane and released him on a $100 bond because he simply didn't believe that something was possible. And yet, think about this. Think about the context. If you were 80 years old, if you were an 80-year-old Texan, Anglo, Tejano, it doesn't really matter. If you were 80 years old on January 6, 1915, here's what you had lived through. Here's what you had witnessed firsthand at age 80 in 1915 when the Plan de San Diego, a war of extermination, was announced in South Texas. You had lived through the Alamo Massacre of 1836, the Goliad Massacre of 1836, the Runaway Scrape of 1836, the Dawson Massacre of 1842, the Vasquez Invasion of 1842, the Wall Invasion of 1842. It's a bad year. The Black Bean Incident of 1843 and the Mier Invasion, the First Cortina War of 1859, the Second Cortina War of 1861, the Las Cuevas War of 1875, the San Elizario Salt War of 1877, and the Garza War of 1891. It had been a continual record of violence, and those are only the major incidents, by the by. The frontier was a violent and bloody place, and what T.R. Fehrenbach described as the collision point of three cultures, Spanish, Anglo, and Indian, was not a peaceful frontier. My friend Dr. Don Frazier at Shriner University likes to say that Texas was the only organically multicultural frontier in the American West, and that's true, but that also came with a great deal of violence. And so we have to understand that when 1915 rolls along, that there is this assumption and this reality that the interface between the United States and Mexico is one of endemic violence and contention, a perpetual contention between two peoples for the land. Now, what happened after that is instructive. The Plan de San Diego unfolds, the state of Texas responds, and then we have a new catalog of violence. I'll read you a shortened, this isn't even the whole catalog of incidents afterwards. You have the Norias Ranch raid of 1915. You have the San Ignacio raid of 1916, which actually featured combat between the Carrancistas and the United States Army. You had the Bright Ranch raid of 1917, the Porvenir massacre perpetrated by Texas Rangers and the U.S. Army against an innocent village of Tejanos out in Presidio County in 1918, and then the Third Battle of Juarez in 1919, in which the United States Army, believe it or not, fought alongside the same Carrancistas who perpetrated the Plan de San Diego 4 years earlier to defeat Vista remnants outside of El Paso. A very confused time, a very violent time. The extent to which this permeated the national consciousness then is forgotten because, of course, the First World War era intervened, and that kind of suffuses the awareness of the period between 1910 and 1920. But we must understand this. Upstairs on the 5th floor of this foundation, in my office on the 3rd floor, I have photographs of a young corporal named Roy Sumter who actually volunteered when the Secretary of War called for volunteers in June 1916 to go defend the United States on the Mexican border. He left a small town of Chatham, Illinois, went south, and served in an artillery unit where he actually saw combat against Carrancista forces in South Texas, a young man from the Midwest. The reason I've got his effects is he is actually my great-great-uncle who was then killed on the Western Front in France the next year. So you can see that this was the norm. It was the historical norm for Texas. Texas was a land that had to be fought for. Something changed in 1920. When the Mexican Revolution concludes, and then when the nature of the relationship between the federal government and the states concludes, we enjoy essentially a century of peace. And we have the border that I grew up with, the U.S.-Mexico relationship that I recall. My family roots are in Laredo and Corpus Christi. And it was essentially Pacific. The border was never entirely safe, but it was a place where you could go and you could shop, you could have lunch, you could cross, and so on. And there was a peaceable intercourse that made it possible by the 1990s, really by the 1980s, to envision something like a NAFTA, to envision a three-nation bloc in North America of neighbors, friends, who actually would work together for a common purpose, for the prosperity of every community from Point Barrow all the way to the Yucatan. So, since 2006, obviously, that dream has faded considerably. And there are two interpretations before us. And I think the purpose of this gathering is to determine which path we take. One path is the path of the reversion to the norm. We can understand the past near century, from 1920-ish to about 2006, of relative peace as being the exception, a historical interregnum, a holiday from history, which is now closed. And then we must return to the previous status quo of endemic violence. Violence, by the way, even though what I've cataloged is violence affecting Texas, that has always principally afflicted our Mexican neighbors. We've always been the principal victims of it. And so we can look at that, and if that is the case, then we must gird ourselves appropriately. And maybe it is. History is contingent, and no one among us can say for sure that we know what's next. But there's another possibility, which is that we can act in both the United States and Mexico, and Texas and Mexico, to make sure that what may seem a holiday from history becomes the new norm. And perhaps there is a scenario in which Mexicans stand up, Americans stand up, same, and Texans lead the way and say that we're not going back. We're not going back to that catalog of violence. We're not going back to that roster of war and raid upon counter-raid that used to characterize the relationship between our two nations. And that is possible. We're a conservative institution here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Most of you all are conservative here as well. Our partners in the Carballo Dialogue are all conservative, and we're grateful to work with you. One of the roots of conservatism is that we understand human nature. We operate from the reality of the nature of man, the fallen nature of man. But we also know that hope abides, else there would be no purpose in our work. And our hope is that things like the U.S.-Mexico Policy Summit, the connections and the friendships that have formed even in this day, can form the foundation of a truly peaceful relationship, and the greatness of both nations can express themselves fully in partnership as neighbors rather than rivals. Let me close with this. For those of you who have been to Mexico City, and if you've never been, I encourage you to go. There's been a lot of criticism of Mexico in this room today, a lot of it from me, but I want to tell you something, that Mexico City, for my money, is the greatest city in the hemisphere. It really is. It is a treasure. Just to imagine that you can fly from Austin in 90 minutes and be in a city with Renaissance architecture, tremendous culture, profound culinary delights. Just one of the most extraordinary cities I have ever seen. I went there for the first time in 2011, and my exposure to the border had been Nuevo Laredo, my friends. Mexico City is something very different. It's very, very good. And so you think about it, one of the jewels of Mexico City is the Museo Sumaya, which is Carlos Slim's museum. Is that right? Yeah. So Carlos Slim, he built it with the cash in his couch cushions. And in the Museo Sumaya, there is a painting. It was so striking. When I rounded the corner and saw it, I gasped. It was that striking of a piece of art. It's by an artist named Jorge González Camarena. And it's a 1980 painting, and so it doesn't appear in any art history books. It's not a particular note, but it was of note to me because of what it expressed. And let me describe the painting to you, and then I'll tell you the title of it. For those of you who've seen it, don't give it away. But the painting is this: it has a Spanish conquistador, and he's in a grip with an Aztec warrior, and their faces are obscured. You can see the helmets and kind of the armor, and each man is running a sword through the other. Each man is killing the other, and the name of the painting is El Abrazo. It's El Abrazo. It's the embrace. And so Camarena is trying to express what he sees as this fusion, the dos culturas. That creates the Mexican nation, Spanish and the indigene, the Aztec, and it struck me so much because it's such a pessimistic and grim and frankly moving a work of art. What a view for the origin of your nation. And here's my wish: Texas and the United States and Mexico are also locked in an abrazo, and we have it within our power to decide what the artists of the next century will paint of that relationship. Whether it's two opposing cultures nevertheless creating a synthesis, running swords through one another, or whether it is a true abrazo de amigos. Thank you all for coming. You've come from such a long way. We're very grateful.